is section 1.2, plant characteristics and diversity. So this is going to go along with your chapter 1, part 2 worksheet. So you can be filling this out as I am reading. All right, everyone, I am going to begin. Plant characteristics and diversity. So feel free to follow along. From the time of the ancient Greeks until the mid-1800s, organisms were simply classified as either plants or animals. They were considered to be plants if they did not move, were green, and did not eat other organisms. Those that moved and ate other organisms were called animals. Accordingly, the category of plants included not only such organisms as mosses, ferns, pine trees, and flowering plants, but also algae and fungi. Algae were included basically because they were green, and fungi were included largely because they did not move. Today, however, botanists consider plants to be fundamentally different from fungi, and plants are usually defined as being separate from algae. In distinguishing plants from other organisms, scientists look at the history of evolution, all the changes that have transformed life from its beginnings to the present diversity of organisms. As organisms have evolved over time, differences in their genes have emerged, which are often reflected in physical characteristics. However, attempts to classify organisms based on physical characteristics and behavior always seem to run into exceptions. After examining how most botanists define plants, we will look at examples of plant diversity. A set of characteristics distinguishes plants from other organisms. The following 5 characteristics, summarized in Figure 1.8, are most commonly used to identify plants and to distinguish them from other living organisms. Number 1. Plants are multicellular, or many-celled, eukaryotes. In modern classification, the most basic distinction between organisms is at the level of the cell, between eukaryotes and prokaryotes. Plants are among the eukaryotes, organisms whose cells have a nucleus, an enclosed structure that contains the cell's DNA. Eukaryotes also include animals, fungi, and protists, such as algae. Prokaryotes are organisms whose cells do not have an enclosed nucleus, such as bacteria. You will read more about prokaryotes, protists, and fungi later in the book. Number 2. Almost all plants are capable of photosynthesis. Since plants can make their own food through photosynthesis, they are known as autotrophs, or self-feeders. By contrast, animals and fungi are heterotrophs, other feeders, meaning that they obtain food from other organisms. Animals ingest their food, while fungi absorb their food. Plants have cell walls composed mainly of cellulose. Cellulose consists of a chain of glucose molecules. Cellulose-rich cell walls help to distinguish plants from other eukaryotes because cell walls of algae and fungi are usually composed mainly of other substances, while animals do not have cell walls. Number 4. Plants have 2 adult forms that alternate in producing each other. One of these adult forms makes spores, reproductive cells that can develop into adults without fusing with another reproductive cell. The other adult form makes either sperm, male reproductive cells, or eggs, female reproductive cells. A sperm fertilizes an egg to produce an embryo that develops into an adult organism. In Chapter 6, you will see how the 2 adult forms in plants alternate in producing each other. For now, suffice it to say that plants have intriguing sexual lives. Plants have a multicellular embryo, protected within the female parent. Protected embryos evolved as an adaptation to life on land, preventing the embryo from drying out. This characteristic distinguishes plants from algae. Each of these characteristics by itself is not unique to plants, but together they are useful for distinguishing plants from other organisms. Two additional characteristics help in particular to distinguish plants from most animals. Unlike most animals, plants can reproduce in two ways. Once they mature, most animals can only reproduce through sexual reproduction, which involves fertilization of an egg by a sperm and results in offspring that are different from either parent. In contrast, plants can produce offspring by either sexual reproduction or by asexual reproduction, in which a single parent produces offspring that are identical to itself. In addition, plant growth is quite different from animal growth. Plants can continue to grow throughout their lives. Since this growth is unlimited, it is known as indeterminate growth. In contrast, an animal basically stops growing after becoming an adult, a pattern known as determinate growth. Figure 1.9 compares key characteristics of plants, animals, fungi, algae, and bacteria. Having looked at the general characteristics of plants, we will take a brief trip through the history of evolution of plant life. If the history of Earth could be compressed into one day, plants would have existed for about the last 2.5 hours. However, they are ancient compared to humans, who would have existed for only the last minute and a half. Most people immediately associate plants with flowers, but flowers evolved relatively late, as you will see in the following overview of major types of plants: mosses, ferns, conifers, or plants with cones, and flowering plants, figure 1.10. Mosses are among the simplest types of plants. Mosses were among the first plants, evolving from algae-like ancestors around 450 to 700 million years ago. They belong to a group of small, non-flowering plants known as bryophytes, from the Greek bryon, moss, and phyton, plant, which are simpler in structure than other plants. You may be familiar with mosses that grow on rocks or form soft carpets on the forest floor. They never grow more than a few inches tall because they are inefficient at carrying water up the plant. Sphagnum moss, which grows in bogs and swamps, is important economically in many regions of the world. Figure 1.10a. When decomposed, it forms a substance known as peat, which can be burned as fuel and also used as fertilizer. In addition, sphagnum moss absorbs a considerable amount of carbon dioxide that would otherwise reside in the atmosphere and could contribute to global warming. Chapter 20 discusses the evolution and characteristics of mosses and other bryophytes. Feel free to look at these figures if you would like. I'm not going to go through them right now, but there certainly are some questions on the sheet tied to those figures. So 1.8, characteristics of a typical plant, and 1.9, comparing plants with some other organisms, as well as the following on this page. 1.10, the diversity of plants. Ferns and their relatives are examples of seedless vascular plants. The vast majority of plants are vascular plants, which evolved from algae-like ancestors around the same time as bryophytes. Vascular plants have highly organized and efficient vascular tissue, which consists of cells joined into tubes that transport water and nutrients throughout the plant's body. Being generally larger than bryophytes, vascular plants are usually more noticeable, although they vary from tiny to towering. The simplest vascular plants are seedless vascular plants, which began to evolve about 450 to 700 million years ago. If you could travel 350 million years back in time, you would find the continents lying together as one landmass, called Pangaea, along the equator, covered in steamy jungles and swamps. Amphibians, some quite large, would rule the world of animals, without a reptile, bird, or mammal in sight. Nor would you find any plants with cones, flowers, or fruits. Instead, a variety of seedless vascular plants would dominate the landscape, some looking much like modern ferns. However, Others would be huge forest trees, some with fern-like branches, but quite unlike anything found today. The most common surviving seedless vascular plants are ferns, which live in moist regions because their sperm have microscopic tail-like structures and must swim through a layer of water to reach the eggs. Figure 110b. Chapter 21 explores the evolution and characteristics of seedless vascular plants. Pine trees and other conifers are examples of non-flowering seed plants. In most vascular plants, the embryo is contained in a seed, a structure that includes not only the embryo, but also a store of food, packaged together within a protective coat. There are two general types of seed plants: non-flowering seed plants and flowering seed plants. Non-flowering seed plants, known as gymnosperms, from the Greek gymnos for naked and sperma for seed, first evolved around 365 million years ago. Their most familiar modern descendants are the woody plants, called conifers, from the Latin conifer, for cone-bearing, whose seeds develop on cones. The seeds are naked only in the sense that they are not completely sealed within a protective layer. Conifers are typically evergreen trees with needle-like leaves such as fir, pine, and redwood trees. Figure 110c. Redwood trees are the world's tallest plants, with heights often exceeding 90 meters or 300 feet. During the Mesozoic era, which was 245 to 65 million years ago, when reptiles were the ruling animals, gymnosperms were the dominant plants and included thousands of species. However, today they consist mainly of only a few hundred species of conifers, commonly seen in colder regions near to the poles and in mountains. Chapter 22 discusses the evolution and characteristics of gymnosperms. Flowering seed plants are called angiosperms, from the Greek angion for container and sperma for seed. Figure 110d. Unlike gymnosperm seeds, the seeds of flowering plants are enclosed in ovaries, which are called fruits, when they mature. Although angiosperms evolved relatively recently, around 145 million years ago, they represent most of the plant varieties we see today. In fact, there are about 20 times as many types of flowering plants as there are ferns and conifers. One reason why angiosperms have adapted more successfully in many environments is that they have a more rapid system for moving water throughout their bodies, as you will see in Chapter 3. Another reason they are so widespread is that their seeds are enclosed in fruits, which provide added protection and may also aid in seed distribution. You will read more about flowering plants in Chapter 23. Bryophytes, seedless vascular plants, gymnosperms, and angiosperms reflect four major evolutionary developments: the origin of land plants from algae, the origin of vascular tissue, the origin of seeds, and the origin of flowers and fruits. Throughout this book, the narrative and evolution box features will explore how characteristics have evolved in various types of plants. To see how plants are scientifically classified into groups, look at the list in the appendix at the end of the book. All right, this concludes section 1.2.